of Trusting News, and we are here today kicking off an initiative we've been planning for a while at Trusting News that we are calling A Road to Pluralism. Trusting News, just a tiny bit of background as we get started. Trusting News has been around since 2016. We work with journalists on understanding how people decide what news to trust and turning that knowledge into actionable day-to-day strategies for journalists who are interested in demonstrating what makes their work credible, separate from what makes the media credible. And A Road to Pluralism is really something we've been talking about since our election coverage, and well, forever, honestly. The idea that news, and especially local news, which is our focus, is really perceived so differently by people depending on how they see the world. And it became clear through our coverage on elections that we really wanted to dive deeper into how people's worldviews, and we mean that broadly, where they stand in the world, how they see the world, how that affects their relationship with local news, and how local news can feel empowered to do something about the fact that so many people see journalism as part of the problem rather than part of the solution, and that democracy does not flourish when we tell oversimplified stories about our communities, when we focus on extremes within our communities, when we are speaking to just parts of our communities that have already decided we're trustworthy and are being completely ignored by others. So that is what A Road to Pluralism is about. We are not here to talk about making the news credible or palatable or appealing to everyone, nor are we about highlighting all views. We are about respecting difference within the whole and figuring out what it looks like for news coverage to feel, for more people to feel like the news is made for and by people like them and understands their values. With that in mind, we're also talking some about who we are as journalists and how what we have in common with the communities we cover, and what by nature of our own path through life, what we don't have in common with our communities. So what we're doing after our deep work with local newsrooms and some recent research we released on how what consumers of local news who identify as conservative, what they have to say about the news, we have identified some themes we're going to be diving into. And today's is the first theme, and it's one we hear about so much. Some local newsrooms feel like they are overwhelmed with feedback, more so sometimes than about the local news. They're overwhelmed with feedback about the national coverage that they include in their local products. So that might be the feed that they get from national NBC if they're an NBC station. It might be text pieces from AP, Washington Post, Reuters. It might be NPR content if you're public radio. People have a lot of feelings about that. They're holding local newsrooms accountable for it. Local newsrooms are selecting it to different degrees. Some local newsrooms have a lot of people focused on that. Other local newsrooms just sort of plug it in, or maybe it's not even someone in their newsroom. Maybe it's someone in a regional hub that's even deciding what to include. But we're hearing so much about how local newsrooms feel about this. So that is the topic for today. It's about political coverage, but beyond that, honestly, it's about national social issues. It's about health and schools and pop culture and sports, and so many ways that people feel like this is just made from a different view. Like, I just don't get it. So I'm so excited. So first, let me introduce the other members of my team who are here. Lynn and Molly, could you say hi?
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Lynn Walsh, and I'm the Assistant Director at Trusting News. Nice to be here with everyone.
Hey y'all, I'm Molly Muchna. I'm the Project Manager with Trusting News.
So we'll be keeping an eye on the chat, and we're gonna get things kicked off today with 3 of our partner journalists who have quite a bit to say about this topic and are gonna share their own experiences and frustrations. And then we're just gonna open it up. We don't have a big presentation planned for you today. So we're gonna hear from them and then open it up for conversations and hear about your own frustrations and challenges and ideas as well. So I'm thrilled today to have Allison Gerber, Mark Rosenberg, and Peter Wappy here. These are newsrooms we've been working with for a while in different capacities. All 3 of them participated in our recent research project where we sent journalists out with an interview guide to talk to people who lean right about their perceptions of local news. So that's the most recent sort of shared experience that we're bringing to bear on today's conversation. But I asked Allison, Peter, and Mark to come today talking about this specific challenge and how it shows up in their work, and what frustrates them about that. And then we're going to pose the same question to other folks in the room. So get ready. Allison, why don't you get us kicked off?
Sure. So I think that,
And actually, I'm sorry, could you guys just say what your role is in the newsroom as you
right.
kick it off, introduce yourself a little?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm Allison Gerber, and I'm the editor of the Chattanooga Times Free Press. Chattanooga is in Tennessee, but it sits on the border of Georgia and Alabama. And so our circulation spills into all of those states. We cover small portions of all of those states. And over the last several years, and really increasing in the last 18 months during the pandemic and kind of in the time frame leading up to the election, the amount of feedback that me and others in this newsroom received from people who consider themselves conservatives, from readers overall, but mostly from people who consider themselves conservative, really increased dramatically to the point where it was happening every single day, multiple times a day. Somebody was calling or emailing or finding a way to reach out to us to tell us that they thought that our news coverage was biased. The comments were almost exclusively directed at national news that was in our paper. And it was also almost exclusively directed at stories in the print paper as opposed to stories online. I think the reason is because if you go to our website, most of the stories there are local, like the stories on the homepage of our website are really local stories. And I also think that part of this, there was sort of a perfect storm situation because at one time, about 10 years ago, we would put 6 stories on the front page of our newspaper every day, and we had a rule that they all had to be local, like that was our rule. And now 10 years later, fast forward 10 years, the country is more politically divided than ever. And we have half the staff in our newsroom that we had. So it's really not possible for us to have an all local front page anymore. So that automatically gives national stories, which are often about politically divisive subjects, much more prominence. We had those stories before, but they were inside the A section. They weren't on the front page to the extent that they are now. I mean, sometimes they were when something huge happened, but not, on a daily basis like they are today. So I think that, when you combine that, people are seeing more national stories at a time when we have, we're very, very divided as a society and as a country. So that's just sort of, I think, what sort of leads to this. So, like I said, the complaints really amped up in the couple of months leading to the election. And then they got even worse in the time between the election and the inauguration, when there were a lot of allegations of fraud on part of the, Trump and his allies. And, readers, one of the things that I repeatedly heard from readers was about word choice in stories. And specifically adjectives and adverbs, like, there was a story that came from one of the wire services we use that said Trump boasted about A, B, and C. And, the reader said, why couldn't you just say Trump said? Why couldn't you just say something that is more neutral? And I consistently heard this theme or these complaints about neutral language. Sometimes even things that are correct, things that are, the wire stories are correct. Sometimes things that are correct, people would still have a gripe with. And one example was, and I'm going to use Georgia as an example because that was, one of the states that flipped from Trump to Biden, and where Trump and his allies claimed fraud. The wire stories would often say things like, Trump baselessly claimed fraud in Georgia. And while that's absolutely true, there has not been any fraud proven in the election in Georgia. I heard from many readers who thought that was just the writer's opinion, or that was a very loaded way to say that. And so what we started doing in our newsroom was changing the wording of stories. So, and adding more context and adding additional details. So for example, in a story that said, Trump baselessly claimed fraud, we would change the wording of that to say Trump has claimed fraud in the Georgia election. And then we would add a paragraph, and we made these boilerplate paragraphs depending on, what the story was. But in a story like that, we would add a paragraph that says, no evidence has been found to support the president's claims of widespread fraud. Georgia Governor Brian Kemp and Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, both Republicans, certified results that show Biden carrying the state by more than 12,000 votes. Georgia did 2 recounts of the original election results, and neither found evidence of widespread fraud. The state did a signature match audit in Cobb County, one of its most populous counties, and found a 99.99% accuracy rate in performing correct signature procedures. And then X number of lawsuits, this was obviously a moving target, have been filed claiming voter fraud. And of those, X number had been dismissed. Raffensperger said voters could have confidence in the results of the election despite, quote, fantastic claims, half-truths, and misinformation. So that's 112 words. So it didn't add too much to the story, but in some cases we would add a shorter version of that. That's sort of the longer version. And we literally wrote like short versions, long versions, things that we could put in. And like, just to be clear, we weren't trying to change the meaning of the stories at all. You know, the stories are well reported. We were just trying to add some context and add additional facts in cases when a story used shorthand to sort of sum up what had happened. And you know, like if this were a local story, if our City Hall reporter filed a story saying, you know, Chattanooga's mayor falsely said X, Y, and Z, and just left it at that, we would kick it back to her and say, okay, you know, you need to change this. And she'd come back with a story that said the mayor falsely said X, Y, and Z. However, documents show A, B, and C, or whatever the case might be. So we sort of just decided to apply the same standards we have for our local newsroom to the national stories. And we created a Slack channel where people on our design or copy desk could alert editors to stories that they felt like needed some editing or needed some, you know, paragraphs like the one I cited added. And, you know, we started just communicating better about stories and looking at stories in a more critical eye, knowing that many of our readers are not going to accept the content of some of those stories. And if that happens, and if we ultimately lose those people, they're going to go to probably a more partisan website. They're not going to trust a different mainstream news organization. They're probably going to go to a news organization that has more of a political leaning. And, you know, in the long run, I don't think that that is good for our society. It's also not good for our industry. So those are, you know, those are sort of some of the steps that we've taken. We participated in the survey and we had over 500 responses, which is a decent number of people. And we heard in those responses many of the same things we had heard from people who were, you know, taking it upon themselves to contact the newsroom. A lot of people talked about language and the use of certain words, and how one repetitive theme that we kept hearing was people saying, I just want facts. I don't want the writer's opinion. I don't want any wording that colors the facts. I want, you know, very plain, neutral language.
Thank you, Allison. I appreciate it. So quite a few folks have joined since we kicked off, so welcome. We are starting today. I'm Joy, the director of Trusting News. We are starting today hearing from 3 of our partner journalists about their experiences, and then we're going to open it up to folks. So I'm going alphabetically here. We're going to move on to Peter Wappy at the Day.
So hi everybody, my name is Peter. I am a multimedia journalist here at the Day. So I work in audio and video mostly, but I've also been our newsroom's liaison to Trusting News for the last couple of years. And that sort of sprung out of research that I was doing during my master's degree. So the Day is a small daily newspaper in New London, Connecticut. And I just wanted to share my experiences mirror pretty closely a lot of what Allison has said. And so I'm going to share a few reader comments regarding their thoughts about wire content and how that influences their opinion of the local reporting that we do. So here's a letter to the editor, and I find the language interesting in here. The Day at long last decided to do a news report on the southern border crisis. So this letter writer is not saying the Day chose to include a wire story about the southern border crisis. the writer does acknowledge the source of the story, the Washington Post. But what I've seen with a lot of the feedback is that people really conflate wire content and local content in a way that we as journalists don't necessarily do. So we've got 30 or so people in our newsroom who every day are just covering our local community and don't ever give a thought to wire stories unless there's some sort of like local angle that we're going to do ourselves. So I think that like we as local journalists think about wire content as just this extra thing on the side of what our newsroom's core competency is. But readers don't necessarily see it that way because they're getting delivered a bundle of information, whether it's online or in print, and it all goes together. And so what they see from one source influences what they think of everything that we present. So here's another one, a complaint that we get much of our information from the Washington Post and the AP. So this is talking about the charges against President Trump. So the reader, again, acknowledges the source of the material, but then uses language like, nowhere do you describe the superficiality of the charges. Nowhere do you inform your readers about the huge number of lies. The Day reported very little. And our immediate thought is to say, like, no reporter at the Day reports on the border crisis. Like the Mexican border is thousands of miles away from us. No staff reporter at the Day is out there reporting on the charges in the House against the president. But it's all a part of the package that we deliver, and people don't necessarily, from the reader's point of view, they don't draw a line as clearly between local and wire the way that I think we do. And so on the question of like, does this influence people's opinion of our staff's production? So here's someone asking, why do you carry content from other newspapers at all? It's all reruns from other rags. No resubscribe here. Try reporting. We do a lot of reporting. We like I said, we've got a staff of people here every day who is out in the community reporting on what's going on in our local towns. But like people don't really acknowledge that. The Day would be better serving our community by more original thought and content on issues local, statewide, and nationally generated by the Day's personnel. So it sort of like raises the question of like, what is the place of wire content in our local publication? There are local newspapers probably with a smaller circulation size than us that are not members of a wire service and don't run a lot of wire content. The Day has always been a small, big newspaper, so that we've, I think, historically always included a mix of national and regional and local news. And so I think if you listen to the loudest critics, it might make us like wonder, like, is it worth including wire content anymore? Is that something that people can get everywhere else? Do they need to come to us for it? These sentiments, though, are not unanimous. So here are some reader comments on those letters to the editor from a lot of people who find the wire services that we use to be factual and reliable and like to have a mix in there. So I think there is a risk in listening to the loudest critics out there and not trying to hear from your whole subscriber base. Like anytime we make a big change or ask a question, when we decided to go from anonymous commenters to real name comments, there was some very, very loud criticism about that move. But when we asked that question broadly of all of our subscribers, it was not at all unanimous. And I'm not sure exactly what the mix was, but if you just listened to a lot of the people in the comment section, you would think nobody likes this. But when you took all of the feedback as a whole, so I mean, I think that it would be worth us finding a way to survey all or a good sample of our audience to see, like, maybe most of our audience actually really does appreciate the wire content and we're making too much of an issue of something. I'm not sure that's the case, but I think it's a question worth asking. And so the last letter that I want to share here is someone calling out a wire story that they thought read more like opinion than like news reporting. And I think this is like, I think there's a tendency among readers where if you see something that conflicts with your worldview, you immediately want to like call the source out as being biased. And so there's some of that I think shouldn't cause us to make a big change. But something that we've been trying to look at is the language that is used in stories. Does it come across as straight reporting, or does it seem to indicate that there is a political lean or agenda, or give the appearance of one, even if like we as journalists know that there isn't, or that there probably isn't. So this person asked, like, is this AP article news, analysis, or opinion? Which is interesting to me because, you know, we talk about the differences between a news story and a column and an explainer and analysis. And I've wondered aloud in some of these conversations, like, do readers draw lines between these two, or do we need to help them? And this indicates to me that at least some people are on the lookout for this sort of thing and understand the difference between analysis and news and opinion. So I just wanted to share then 2 examples of wire stories that either readers have called out over the past couple of weeks, or someone internally has said, hey, we should think more about the language being used here. So this was a wire story about the budget process in Congress. And so the headline says, beware of budget gimmicks. So this reads to me like this already sounds to me like commentary or opinion or analysis, that the author is telling me as a reader to beware of something. And then there's some speculation in here. Here's how they may do it again. Some of the savings proposals are legitimate, either could go too far. Other questionable proposals include. So we sort of had a discussion over, would it be appropriate to take this wire story and relabel it as analysis? We don't really have like a set of guidelines for when we would do that and whether we only do that on our stuff or on wire stuff. So that's a conversation that's sort of developing. Now, an interesting note to this is one of the senior copy editors who's been working with wire content for a long time, he recognizes the name of the author here. Alan Fram is an AP staffer who has been covering the budget in Congress for 30 plus years. So that actually probably is somebody who is qualified to offer this analysis. So, you know, maybe it would be a good idea to label a story like this analysis and then give a bio of this author. So it's not just some like nameless guy from Washington. Like, this is actually somebody who in the industry has a lot of expertise. So one more story I want to share is, so a story about changes to voting rights laws. So the language in this story, Democrats are facing renewed pressure. Republicans pass tougher rules under the cloak of election integrity. There's a sense of urgency among Democrats to act. Changes won't be easy. Republicans show no sign of willingness to engage. This is a very factual article. There are lots of sources cited. They speak to Democrats and Republicans, but the language that's used in it makes it sound like it's being written from a point of view that assumes what the Democrats are doing is right, and this is how they would need to achieve it, and this is what's in their way. So it feels like the language that's being used, and this was one that was actually originally called to our attention by someone on our staff, but the first reader comment on the story was a question, is this on the opinion page? That's where it belongs. So we're still kind of early in these conversations in our newsroom about what, if anything, to do, but it's causing us to try to look a little bit more carefully at the language used in some of these stories.
Thanks, Peter. I appreciate the specifics. One of the things we're trying to do here is we're very solutions oriented at Trusting News, and we're very we help journalists come up with specific things they can do day to day. So what we're listening for here are specific problems journalists are facing and specific perceptions from readers, and we're taking notes about what we might work with newsrooms to do in our new Pluralism network, which we'll tell you about at the end here. So let's hear from Mark, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the group. Mark, if you could introduce yourself.
Hey guys, thank you so much for having me. My name is Mark. I'm a reporter for the Victoria Advocate. We're a newspaper that covers 7 counties in South Texas, located about an hour from the Gulf and 3 hours from the border. And so I also participated in this very cool project that Trusting News did earlier this spring, where we basically conducted surveys with a bunch of self-identified conservative readers, and then conducted interviews with a couple of them. And I went into those conversations expecting to have a really in-depth conversation about local news stories and local issues and you know, local elections and things like that. But instead, the conversations ended up being totally dominated by wire and syndicated content and our coverage of national issues, or syndicated coverage of those issues that we've run in our paper. And that just made me realize what a disconnect there was between what we actually do at the paper and how our readers perceive it. Because, as a reporter, I'm spending 100% of my time, 95% of my time talking about local issues and how it affects the 6 counties I cover on my beat. And that's true for pretty much everyone on our staff. And I think that's what we really pride ourselves on, is, catching the local stories that aren't getting covered elsewhere. But, those stories were getting maybe 10 comments when we put them on Facebook, and then the syndicated stories we put online about controversial topics might get 100 or 200. And so it just made me realize that people's perception of our paper was really dominated by our wire coverage, even though, what we offer that others papers don't is our local coverage. So, that made me realize what a disconnect there is there. Peter and Allison have touched on some of kind of the editorial approaches to dealing with this, but this has also got me thinking a little bit about what I can do as a reporter to try and sort of cover national topics or cover national issues that provoke controversy from a local angle. Because I think sometimes that's what we have to do as reporters, to kind of find a trusted voice in our community and cut through some of that polarization. I also came prepared with some comments from some recent stories we've run, but here's a few comments from our daily case counts, our COVID case counts, which we publish on Facebook each day. This is just from yesterday. Why does the Advocate deliberately mislead the public? Selling fear, a branch off of CNN, what more would you expect? And just wait, they'll be pushing the tropical disturbance down our throats in 3, 2, 1, which I at least thought was pretty creative, but it's just, it can be a little bit dismaying to see those national stories just seeing, when there's coverage of COVID, or there's coverage of the election or border security, seeing our readers so predisposed not to trust us because the national content they see and just our conversations about it are so charged. But what I did recently was I sat down and did an interview with a local doctor who is the director of the emergency room at one of our hospitals, and just asked him about some of the, the staffing issues, the patients they were seeing, how the Delta variant was different from other variants. And that story received a very different reception from our readers on Facebook, even though it got just as much traffic, if not more. I mean, some of the comments were, thank you, Dr. McNeil and all the staff at our local hospitals working so hard to help us. God bless you. Thank you for an excellent local description of what's going on. And so I think the issue we face with a lot of the national stories is, if people feel like they've been seeing COVID coverage on every cable network, or, if they see syndicated copy that they perceive as maybe alarmist, or they're just tired of hearing about it, I think, we lose our ability to engage with them as a local newspaper, and that can be really challenging. But I think on the reporting end, it's showed me that, the solution isn't to step away from covering these national issues, because they do affect us locally, and that would be kind of letting go of our responsibilities, but it's to find a trusted voice locally, or to talk to a local hospital, or to find a way to kind of make that topic more familiar to our readers. We did that with border security too. We've gotten tons of calls into the newsroom about that, and we've gotten criticism of some of the syndicated content we've run. And one of the folks I interviewed as part of this survey project said, I'd like to see you guys go down to the border, and I'd like to see you guys cover this. And a lot of national news stories, we can't do that because we don't have the resources. But this time we actually, after having that conversation and talking as a newsroom, we actually did do that. We sent a couple reporters and a photographer down to the border. And it just made me realize that people do want to see that national coverage, but sometimes they want to see it from a trusted voice, or sometimes they want to see it from, a paper they're familiar with. So I think there's a lot to be done on the editorial end, and we've had conversations about that, about, some of the word choice things that Peter mentioned, or, what stories are we publishing online. But I think there's a lot on the reporting end to consider here too, of, how can we fight through this challenge, and how can we kind of earn readers' trust, even on the most controversial issues, and even on the issues where, we have the most challenges with our wire coverage. So it's a challenging one, but I think it's got me realizing that, if the national coverage is dictating so much of what people think of their local publications, then we just really have to get it right, and we really have to tread carefully, and we really have to think critically about what we're publishing and how. And so I hope people have good suggestions out there, because we could definitely use more.
Thank you, Mark. I'm pasting in the chat something I wrote this week that lists a bunch of questions we have, like, how do you separate in your audience's minds your local values and local staff from the national coverage you run? How do you explain who on your staff selects it, what the variables are in terms of news hole, what types of stories you're looking for, and why you include them? How are you telling that story? So we have a ton of questions, but we are hearing more and more from reporters like Mark that, sources are turning down requests for interviews because they're frustrated because of their perceptions of a bias in the media, and sometimes that has to do with national coverage. So this is where we're going to open it up, and a lot of smart folks here. So what we would love for you to do is unmute yourself if you feel comfortable, or stick in the chat if you don't. And the questions we have to throw out are, how does this challenge show up in your own work or with your specific audience? And what frustrates you the most about this topic? We would love to hear from other folks who are here.
This is John from AP.
Hey, John, I'm so glad you're here.
Yeah, this is a really good discussion, and I appreciate it. And it's not unlike, I've heard from Allison before, and we're having a discussion with the day later today. And I know that this is an ongoing problem of, how some of the things we report and some of the words we use have been, are sort of rejected as unpalatable or even untrue by some readers. And I think, one problem that exists for us and for all the AP's newspaper members is that people are being groomed in a way to disbelieve anything written by the so-called mainstream media, and are being groomed, I think, quite deliberately to instead choose media that supports their view of the world. And so what you have now are readers who are, I think, actually scouring stories, looking for biases of one kind or another, and often seeing it where it's not there. But I do agree that it would be useful to use the analysis slug. And I really like the suggestion about Alan Fram's story, that we could have put there in his story why he's been covering this for 30 years and why he's well positioned to make these observations. And I don't know, we do, when we hear from newspapers in real time, we often can change stories if there's a problem with them. So I think it's really important to keep letting us know about these things as they come up. But I hear what's being said here. I know it's a problem for local newspapers, just as it's a problem for us to try to reach these people who will tend to see bias. I'm not saying that every story is perfect. It's obviously not, and we definitely can do better. But we also need to stand up for facts and not report things or that we know are true. So,
thank you. I appreciate that. Noreen, hi.
Hi.
Noreen had her hand up next.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Noreen Gillespie. I'm in charge of U.S. News at AP, and thanks for hosting this session. This is really interesting.
Goodness.
And hi to a few friends, Allison and others out there who we talk to routinely. I did also just want to say that, this is 100% right. If there are things that are coming up in daily language that you're concerned about, go straight to John. We can talk about that. Sometimes we'll be able to make a change. Other times we may disagree, but we want to hear it. I mean, the interesting thing about AP is that, we send everything out in, to a million different fire hoses around the country, and you get a different reaction in sort of each of those gardens, right? And so we want to know that, because that helps us form content that works for your audience and other audiences. Not all of our content is going to work for every audience, and we don't want it to, right? But there are ways that we can help you with your audience strategy. Over the past, I would say 12 months, we've also been doing a lot more in terms of bringing our staff into the newsrooms of a lot of our customers. So for example, in Texas right now, we're working with a group of small papers on the border with their reporters and our national immigration team so that they can work together and co-create content, so that we can start to get over some of those gaps in terms of how the story is viewed in that community and how we're reporting it as a news agency. We've also been doing more in terms of a localization strategy, so we can try to unpack some of the expertise from people like Alan Fram, and then give inputs to help create content at the local level that can complement the AP content. So a great example of this was with the rent moratorium that's been going on. We had localization guides that went in all 50 states. We've done story consults with newsrooms to help them set their strategy and get them moving on a topic where they may not have had expertise before. So, I think as we look at this problem, one really important question to ask is, how do we look at this beyond a content problem? It's also, a creation and teamwork problem, so that we can make sure that we're reflecting all of those perspectives across the coverage.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Who else was ready to talk there?
I see something sort of following up on what John said. I think that in the past, when news organizations covered events that were very, divisive in American society, like take, for example, the desegregation of schools. A lot of people didn't think that should happen, particularly in the South, but they got the news mostly probably from their local paper, and a lot of it might have come from wire services or other places, maybe from radio, maybe from television in some cases. But now I feel like they were still getting that news reported, whether they agreed with what was happening. They were still getting that news reported from the mainstream media, from a legitimate news organization. But now if people don't agree with what they're seeing, or if it doesn't align with their worldview, they do have the option of rejecting that and moving on to a website or some sort of news source that does reinforce their view of the world. And I don't think that it's certainly not specific to conservatives. I mean, it's across the political spectrum. But I do think that's a dynamic that our industry did not have to face in the past.
Yep, and that is why that's why our initiative is called A Road to Pluralism, the idea that that we want to be having a shared conversation and engaging with the best version of each other's arguments. Daryl, were you trying to say something? I think you were muted.
I believe I'm unmuted now. Great. So
could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, I am publisher. My name is Daryl LaPrade, and I am publisher of the Delaware State News. I see John shaking his head.
I'm shaking my head at the terrible news out of Afghanistan just now. Sorry.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear. Yes, we have encountered the same sort of problems that have been described here with our newspaper. And we, in fact, took it upon ourselves to publish and continue to publish every day a disclaimer that says that while we pay the Associated Press for news services, and that we recognize that all stories from the Associated Press are as balanced and as unbiased as the standard we strive to meet in our own stories. We also point out that the Associated Press remains the most practical and affordable source of world, national, and sports news available to us. And that, and we also say that our editors and reporters are firmly committed to purposeful neutrality. The unfortunate thing is, at my newspaper, I don't have time, my copy desk doesn't have time to comb through the Associated Press stories that we run. We select them carefully. We know our audience pretty well. We're in Dover, Delaware. So there's our audience consists of many retired military folks. So we do our best to publish relevant material from the Associated Press, but we don't have time to go through it. And as John, I think, would tell you, we submitted to him at least a dozen examples of stories that contained, the only word I can think of is bias. Now, it may have been unintentional bias on the part of the reporter, but those stories were biased in how they described either President Trump or some other action, Postmaster LaJoy, et cetera. And I also would say that John was very gracious about accepting our criticism and put us in touch with the appropriate people on the regional level so that we could go to them if we had specific problems. I would say that our strategy has become to link national stories whenever possible to a local story or a local issue or a local person, because the one thing that I have found both on my opinion pages and in the news pages of my newspaper is that if I want to turn down the temperature, if I want to bring people closer together and try to close that gap, that polarization that exists, I've got to talk to them on the local level. I cannot, and I can, but I find that when we dwell on national issues, when they hit our opinion pages, the vitriolic, the vitriol between the exchanges becomes much greater than it is when we deal strictly on the community level. I love the idea that Noreen mentioned, that you're trying to unpack these things on a local level. I think that's terrific. And we rely on Randall Chase, your reporter down here, for his good reporting. He does a good job for us. But I just don't know how you're going to filter out. I don't know what you're going to do and how you're going to filter out some of the inherent bias that's built into these stories. And believe me, I can supply you, John, with a whole nother list, because we've got a running list. So That's all I have. And I'm not complaining about AP. I'm only saying that I wish I had more people to edit the copy more closely, which I don't.
One thing you said, Daryl, that's so interesting that mimics what Mark was saying is just the power of how the conversation changes, how the narratives change, how the response and the comments change when you're able to keep it focused on local. And I wonder, I'd love to hear from folks with ideas or frustrations around that, around how people conflate and how we might differentiate what our local staff does with the national news that we share. I'm interested in things like, how like sort of FAQ information, transparency information around who we are and what we do. I'm interested in what we share on social media, what we put in newsletters, what we put in print, and sort of the emphasis on that. We've talked a lot about sort of the content of those stories. I'm also interested in the prominence that we give those stories and how we sort of explain where they come from. So I wonder, I'd love to talk about what we want to do and what we'd like to try, and talk both about the content of the stories, but also about the things that are more in our control as local newsrooms, how we play it and how we frame it and that sort of thing. So Allison, Mark, and Peter, I don't know if you'd have anything you'd want to jump in with around what you'd like to try and do, and then I'd love to hear from other folks as well. Peter, I see your hand up.
So in the survey of conservative readers, one thing that I heard over and over again was, why do you pick the stories that you do? Who is picking these stories? How do you pick them? Like, people feel like there's a lot of like opacity around how does this stuff happen? And so that's like on our list of things to do, is to find a way to be more transparent and like give people a peek behind the curtain and say like, this is how we choose wire stories. These are because also like our reporters' names and faces are out there, but like our copy desk staff isn't necessarily like well known by the public. The hard thing about this is like we've got good ways of doing this, but a lot of times it's like we put something like that out there, whether it's like a story or like behind the scenes video, an interview with one of our staff members. It lives there for a couple of days and then it vanishes, and then the same question comes up a month later and 6 months later, and I think it would be difficult to say like, let's add something else to the read pages of our stories. Like, want to know how we pick who picks AP stories, like go here to find that. Like we're already adding more and more different things, labels, widgets, etc., onto stories. And it's sort of, so it's how best to do that in a way that lives on beyond just like the one time.
Yes, we find that so often with strategies across Trusting News that we'll like write a column or make a video, and then we pat ourselves in the back saying, look, we explained something, and nobody ever sees it again after that day. Emily, hi.
There I am. Hello, Emily from the Burlington Free Press in Vermont. And we were also part of the previous iteration of this group. Well, I think people have been added, but did interviews with, and wire was another issue that came up for us as well. I don't have a full solution because we're part of Gannett, USA Today Network, and the print responsibilities are more and more being regionalized, and that's a bit outside my purview. But I was trolling around on my alma mater's website. I went to Mizzou for graduate school, and Joy was there at the time. And one thing that I actually really liked was that they have the editor now listed at the bottom of the story, and it almost looks like it's an embed of some sort. I think it would be too arduous or too cumbersome to expect an editor to add their tagline to everything, but it seems like that's built into their CMS. And as we all know, I think most of us here would agree that the shape of a story is often very much influenced by an editor. And right now, at least I don't think there's an eagerness across large news organizations to put for certain people to put their names front and center. I happen to have my cell phone on the masthead of our paper, and I hear from people all the time, and it's pretty labor intensive and exhausting. And I think it would make sense to spread that transparency around a little bit. So I've even thought like it would be great. I don't know if it sometimes just gets cut. I don't think when I go to AP News, I don't necessarily see the contact information. If there's a question or a clarification, it comes, usually that comes to me because they see my name on the masthead, and that's how they're like, you are responsible. You know, I have a lot of power in the minds of the reader, which is kind of cool and kind of terrifying.
Awesome, thank you. Nash, hi.
Hey, I'm Nash Jones. I'm over at KUNM News. We're a NPR affiliate out of Albuquerque, New Mexico. I was thinking about, as an NPR affiliate, we run a lot of our local content on All Things Considered and Morning Edition. So we have NPR's national content, but we also stack our newscast with a lot of AP wire stories. And so kind of both of those, the national level, but our kind of regional stories or even local stories are often AP wire content. And I think we, as a newsroom, could do a better job of demarcating that. I think as an NPR affiliate, we recognize that a lot of our listeners do not differentiate between us and NPR. Sometimes people will be like, you tell that Steve Inskeep to do this or that. And I'm like I know Steve, you know, like I'm like in the studio with him. And so, you know, it's kind of a funny dynamic where I recognize that our listeners don't differentiate between our local newsroom and the national content that we air. But I also, and so I think we could do a better job of differentiating that for them. We do that more kind of on an individual basis when we get these listener complaints or people asking questions. But I also don't think it's, and I think our newsroom does a good job, but I don't think it's responsible for us to respond to them. And I think it's kind of an instinct to get a little defensive and say, that wasn't us, that was NPR. That wasn't us, that was the AP. That's not our work. We're doing a better job of that or whatever. And I hear a little bit of that in this conversation, right? The local outlets feeling like, yeah, we know that they messed up, but we didn't. And I think that it's important for myself, I select the AP stories that we run in the mornings for me to feel like I can stand behind those and take responsibility for them. And while clarifying that for our listeners, that was an AP story, and if there needs to be a correction, you need to take it up with them, but also feeling like their stories are in line with our values and that we can stand behind them and that they are us when we are running their content and they're affecting how we're seen as a newsroom. So I think that that's really important. And we try to also, you know, add context. We have this great regional AP newsroom that does a really good job of covering New Mexico stories, but they often, their language will be a little more nationally focused. And so making sure that we're adding that context. If there's a police shooting, our police department here locally is under a DOJ investigation. If that is not mentioned, it is really essential that we add that context, that we are shifting any kind of passive voice language around a police shooting, a police involved shooting, and because that's not our values as a newsroom to use that kind of passive voice. And so we do some of that language shifting. We have a lot of coverage about the Navajo Nation, which is in our listening area. And the AP will always say, the Navajo Nation is, spans Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico. Our listeners know that, and, making sure that they feel spoken to, and like it's not somebody from somewhere else that's talking to them is a really important part of it. But I think there's just an element of when those one-on-one conversations are happening to not say that was them, not us, and recognize that it was us because we ran it and we brought it to them.
Thank you. That's so helpful. We've got 4 minutes left, so I want to go to Chelsea and Mark, and then I will wrap us up.
Hi, I'm Chelsea Perkins. I am the community editor of the Brainerd Dispatch in Brainerd, Minnesota, and we are part of Forum Communications Company. And I wanted to just bring forward that we are actually in the middle of kind of an experiment on our Facebook, our social media pages, where we have eliminated posting nation content for the most part, unless it is like really big news. And so I know I'm on the editorial advisory board, the company-wide editorial advisory board, and that's been a focus of ours to look at ways that we can get more local opinion content into our papers so that there's less focus on basically, you know, we had a lot of Trump commentary that was happening from our wire services on our opinion pages, and we just are looking for ways to show readers that we're more locally focused than nationally. And a lot of the heated comments we were getting on social media were on the nation content, not on the local issues. So we've actually seen that there's been very little change in our Facebook referrals to our websites. Even eliminating that nation content, we weren't getting a lot of direct referrals from that to our websites. So it's interesting to see how that has shifted. We're still getting heated commentary on COVID stories, whether they're local or not. I think to a certain extent, you can avoid some of that, but I just wanted to point out that, you know, there's ways to like use social media that you can kind of manipulate, you know, how people view your publication. And we've been really trying to aim that more at local. We also just launched an Ask the Editor series, Facebook Live, where we're trying to do a monthly thing and giving people the chance to directly ask us, like, why did you choose that story? What are you doing in your newsroom? How do your reporters do their work? So
it sounds like I should know you. It sounds like you're doing a lot of things that we recommend. So I put my email in the chat. I would love to connect and hear more about what you're doing. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Mark, do you want to jump in before I close this out?
Sure, I'll try and keep it real quick, but I just thought, I thought Nash made a really good point about, you know, if you're selecting stories, being able to stand behind them. And it reminded me of something Allison said earlier about just kind of the problem of resources. I think for us as a newspaper, this comes up a lot too, but, you know, not having as many people to select and curate stories, but also a lot of the time the reason we have an AP story on A1 is not because, you know, it was the most important story that day, but because we didn't have as many other local stories to go around, and it's kind of a filler. But our readers see that and they think, you know, we selected that story for importance, and we're promoting it, and we're trying to bring as much attention to it as possible. And so I think the fact that it's kind of a reactive process instead of a proactive process causes some problems for us. And, you know, it's tough, you know, with the staff shrinking and not having as many personnel to make those decisions. But I wonder if there's a way, you know, newsrooms like ours could say, what are the 3 big national stories that we should try and feature on the front this week? Let's make sure we can plan to get each of those covered. That'll take the weight off us on the local content a little bit. And it'll make sure we're kind of, you know, we're not just bombarding people with COVID stories just because we don't have other stuff to publish, but we have kind of a game plan of these are the national stories we really need to hit. So I think that's a challenge for us, and it takes time to implement those kinds of things. But I think just finding a way to be proactive with it would be helpful. So
this is exactly the kind of stuff we're going to be doing in our Pluralism network. Molly just stuck a link in the chat. We want to group newsrooms together to say, what happens if we ask our audience what they want, what national stories they want? What happens if we stop putting national stories on our Facebook page? So if you have things you want to learn, please let us know, and we'll get newsrooms together to experiment. And if you want to join us in those experiments, which just means joining a Slack workspace and chatting with other newsrooms who have the same frustrations and then trying things out for yourself, we're so excited about that. So thank you. I'm sorry I kept you 1 minute over. I'll hang out in case folks have questions, and thanks so much for joining us today.